Good afternoon, everyone. Listening to that introduction makes me feel I probably should be across campus at another college instead of the ag school, but policy background is where I come to the table with this, and it's a great honor for me to be at the front of the room here. I came to Cornell about 15 years ago when I was on the House Ag Committee, looking at some of the research programs you all had at that time and probably still are working on in some areas. And I've always been amazed at the capacity that's at this university and walking around compared to some of your sister universities around the country. So it's great to be here, and it's great to talk about what ASTA does, what our members do, and the collaboration that we have with the land-grant institutions and the public research community in the U.S. So I'm going to try to get through this in about 20 to 30 minutes and hopefully provide plenty of time for questions and answers, dialogue, debate. I don't have a screen up here, so hopefully no tomatoes. But please think of those questions and save them for when we get to that time at the end. I want to talk a little bit about ASTA first, who we are. A lot of people have different perceptions about ASTA and the seed industry. I want to talk about where we are currently today in the policy arena with respect to the coordinated framework. I think most of you are probably familiar with that, and it's the process that traits or biotech traits go through for deregulation in the U.S. and the review of that. And then talk about plant breeding, what we call as plant breeding innovations. Several people will know it as new breeding techniques, gene editing, anything along those lines. But where plant breeding is going and where we see an issue both domestically with respect to policy and then internationally with respect to policy and the various factors that are impacting how plant breeding will be addressed in policy arenas in Washington, D.C., as well as around the world in capitals. So it really does impact what you're doing here in plant sciences and in agriculture, as well as what we're doing in the private sector. So ASTA is an association that was founded in 1883. And our main goal back then, and still is today, was to look at germplasm and how do we improve varieties and bring new varieties of seed to growers around the world. Promote the development of better seed to produce better crops for a better quality of life. You know, we were talking about it earlier. I had the opportunity to sit with a group of the grad students here. And I mean, one of the things that we look at is the seed is truly the engine. I don't care what production practice you use, organic, conventional, biotech. We don't care what tools you use to produce that seed or to grow that seed. If you start with a seed that's a bummer to start with, what kind of a yield are you going to get? It's all about that engine. The engine that you start with is the seed. And that's where our companies look at that quality of the seed provided to the grower. And I think that's where we have debate sometimes across the board, whether it's here in the US or whether it's when I'm traveling internationally. Well, farmers should be able to save their seed. Well, and that's fine. We've seen that in a lot of situations. But farmers also realize the benefit of purchasing seed every year from a company that's improving that continually. So we'll have some more conversation about that, but this is our goal as we move forward. And the beauty that I love about ASTA is we've got about 720 companies. They produce everything from alfalfa to zucchini. Anything planted with seed, we essentially probably represent that company. We can look at row crops, vegetables, conservation crops, cover crops, pollinator crops, flowers, you name it. Ball horticulture, burpee seeds, Scott's, Pennington, Monsanto, Syngenta, Cicada, Taki. I can go all day long. We've got that diversity, and that's how our board is. Whether you pay the max dues at ASTA or you pay the minimum dues at ASTA, you can be on our board of directors. So if you look at that diversity, our chairman's AgReliant Genetics. They're I think the fourth largest corn seed provider in the Midwest. Mark used to run the commercial side of Seminis vegetables at Monsanto. Tracy Talley is a small sorghum seed company out of Texas. He's got 4 employees. He's got the same vote as a Monsanto has, or as Jerry Flint has at DuPont. So that beauty of nobody has more votes because they paid more at ASTA is meaningful. We sit around our board table with 21 members that all have 1 vote, no matter what size company they represent. And it's diverse. So you don't come in and you're not talking about competitive traits. You're talking about to the person who produces conservation crops. Oops. God, that was quick 50 minutes. Conservation crops with somebody who's producing wheat and soybeans. So really that helps to deal with the quality of seed as we go forward. And then just a breakdown of our regions. We're based on regions. The VP for this area, the regional vice president, is a conservation seed producer out of Pennsylvania. Very big in pollinator crops in the eastern side, east of the Mississippi. So very diverse in that. And again, a little bit about ASTA. These are some of the issues that we've been juggling in the last year, several months. Everything from GMO labeling, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, which finally just got ratified by the Senate. Food safety issues, seed treatments and pollinators. We're in the middle of it. Organic seed, availability of organic seed, those kind of things. State activities, communications. I'll hit on a little bit at the end, trying to help people understand what plant breeding is. I'll say it now. I mean, a lot of people think plant breeding is Monsanto owns everything and everything's biotech, and that's plant breeding. They don't understand the breadth of what our companies do and the breadth of what has to happen every year. And then our favorite topic these days is plant breeding innovations. The evolution of plant breeding and the opportunities that are there today to really maximize the characteristics that are in varieties that are in seed today is phenomenal because of better understanding of the plant. You know this better than I do, so I'm not here to preach, but it's a continuum. And I'll show you a video or a quick piece on this real quick. But it's that continuum that builds upon all the expertise that you've got and that your forefathers in the breeding industry developed as we go through all the techniques. Here it is. You know, all of these things that have started 10,000 BC all the way through, but you look at these techniques that have come along and that will continue to be key to, and this will continue. To me, I like to equate it, it's the Moore's Law of the plant community. What you're doing to better understand the physiology of that plant and what makes it do what it does, the soils, the importance of the soil biome, all of those kind of things that help to produce that, maximize that plant. So when we look at what's impacting plant breeding and plant breeding policy today, there's a number of factors that are outside plant breeding directly. And so I need to set a stage for you so you sort of understand the atmosphere in which we're working in Washington, as well as in Brussels, as well as other places around the world. The coordinated framework, which is the overlaying regulatory structure for the biotech community, is under review currently. Coordinated framework was set up in the 1990s. It was cobbled together from a couple of different regulations because nothing passed the Congress to create it. And it was set up to be a pre-market process review of traits coming to the marketplace and then deregulate them. The US is the only country that deregulates products. Most countries regulate them through their life cycle. So that set up obviously a global process that we had to deal with. And this, the second, I can't do the pointer very well. The second arrow there, some regulators continue to think that regulation of biotech products gives consumers comfort. I'm not sure how many in this room feel that that's a true statement or not, but we've had regulators up to last week saying, well, if we regulate plant breeding techniques, then they'll give more confidence to the consumer. And I asked them, have you seen the discussions on GMO and how well you're doing with that one? Why would you want to do the same with plant breeding techniques? So that's sort of the mentality that we're dealing with within the Beltway. And this coordinated framework was set up to essentially decline as more confidence came in, more understanding came in. You had more years of certainty of use of the biotech traits. That has not happened. It's gone the other way. And our discussion, as we talked about it, so you see it's not just about genome editing. In the US, we're looking at the coordinated framework, both Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, and then the Biotech Regulatory Services at USDA. So we can't look at gene editing in a vacuum. You've got NGOs that want plant breeding innovations to be classified, or they classify them as hidden GMOs, therefore they need to be regulated. So we're dealing with that issue. And this really does set precedent for future innovation. We know that the impacts of where GMOs are with respect to deregulation, with respect to going to more crops than the current 5, 6 that are there, large field crops that are processed food crops and energy crops and feed crops like vegetables won't happen if they're regulated like GMOs are today. So that's why we have to look at it in this big perspective. And then the impact on public research. We know that it's a challenge for our public institutions to use or interact or research in the GMO space, and a lot have just chosen not to. And we just feel that we can't go there with plant breeding techniques as well. So it really is working on a very active public-private collaboration. We feel that the current GMO regulations, domestic and international, are a barrier to innovation. The seed industry is increasingly global. Seed is moved and bred, grown out, tested all around the world. Tomato varieties, if you're ever involved with those, it may be grown in 5, 6, 7 countries before it's actually commercialized, brought into production. Whether it's testing, whether it's grow outs, whether it's multiplication, all of those factors are companies are moving them all over the world. And same with even our row crops. And then the impact on collaboration, and what we're trying to do in the international seed industry is work on unified policy goals across the world. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But common themes as we talk through this, and as we've talked at it at the Washington level and the international level, is people like to talk about regulation first. We like to talk about policy. Currently today, varieties are not pre-market reviewed and approved before they come into the marketplace. Biotech traits are. But varieties, when they come into the marketplace today, whether you're an onion breeder or a grass seed breeder, they don't go through a regulatory process, a pre-market process. There's always something in the marketplace to regulate it when it comes commercial, whether it's the Plant Pest Act, whether it's FDA, whether it's food requirements under the State Departments of Ag. It is regulated somewhere, and it can be pulled from the marketplace pretty quickly. So it is regulated. The question is, should it be pre-market regulated? We like to talk about how do we address policy in plant breeding, not regulation. Not talking about all applications of gene editing. And I'll show a little bit of a distinction here. You heard in my background, I worked for Florida Citrus Mutual. That's the growers in Florida who produce citrus or orange juice products. They're being devastated right now by citrus greening. One of the most promising varieties that are out there is a cross between, I believe it's an early mid variety and a spinach gene. We believe that's probably going to fall into the regulatory review process. If you go in and you take a spinach variety and a distant relative that is immune to, say, downy mildew, and it's a dog producer, but it's got a great resistance to downy mildew, that shouldn't be considered to have to go through the regulatory process if you bring in that characteristic or that trait from the family member. So how do you distinguish that when the gene editing category is this great new innovation that's going to save everything? Well, we've got to see, can we draw a distinction? The other part that you get into there is the issues of ethical dilemmas. Because a lot of people like to put this under one umbrella, so you bring in human, animal, and plant. I don't think there's as many ethical dilemmas within plant breeding as there is when you deal with human, in vitro breeding or other types of breeding that can deal with drastic diseases, childhood disease and things. So we're trying to make sure there's some differentiation when you get into it there. We talk about a third class of products. Just imagine if we were in the marketplace and you had a lettuce variety that had to go into the regulatory process, but then they said, okay, you're not regulated. Everyone's going to say, well, you had to be reviewed, so there must be something wrong with your process. It had to go through regulation. Why are you no longer regulated? And you get into this push-pull, are you sure you're okay? And so you get tarnished. And then continue quality practices as we go along. We look at it sort of like this, and this is public, it's out there. We've given it to the White House, we've given it to USDA, we've given it to the international arena. How do you determine in here where that line is drawn? And I sort of just described it to you This is us giving ideas or concepts to the public breeding community as well as the administration. We look at it kind of three components there: sexually compatible, no expressed protein, and you could essentially get there through what we would call conventional breeding with backcrossing. We think that line is drawn somewhere around here. So can we make that distinction? And that's where we're working to try to, as a policy, can you develop something that is somewhat of a bright line in this process? So the current domestic situation, I mentioned that USDA is revising the biotech regulations. We anticipate getting a proposal out before the end of this year. Everyone knows where we are in the political cycle. Next administration will look at everything that was dropped within probably 90 days of the new administration. Do they keep those going or do they start over? And so the question is, what will that look like? Often becomes the place mark for the next administration of where they start on policy. So we're actively involved with that with the coalition. I mean, the coalition of public breeders, coalition of fruit and vegetable associations, row crop associations, the grocery manufacturers, food marketing. They all have an interest in this. What's it going to do down the road to their part of the food value chain? EPA, they've got the same situation. Where do they come into play? EPA has had a policy in place for many, many years. They don't regulate plant breeding. They will get into issues like BT and other things that deal with the FIFRA type claims, or the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, that would fall under their purview. But they have had a policy that they don't regulate plant breeding. And we're trying to work with that and the interpretation of that. And PIP is plant incorporated protectants, or BT varieties. FDA is the same. FDA has got a kind of a decision tree, as they call it. If this, then this and that. You need to come for review, or you need to apply. It just depends on what process you go through. That essentially gives you good guidance, and that's for food as well as plant products. And then transparency becomes one of those issues across the board. The administration, I think we've probably caught ourselves somewhat by surprise, the rapid evolution that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years in plant breeding. Imagine the folks that are writing policy. They may have a science background, but they're not bench scientists anymore. They don't know what's out there. They talk to some of you as peers that are out there, but they're trying to understand what's going on and what are you doing. So how do we communicate that to the administration? What are the trends? What are the practices being used? And how do we become proactive from the industry standpoint to talk about that? We don't feel we have anything to hide. So how do we essentially have an open book? What public information can we put on the ASTA website that people can access to better understand it? We're looking to develop some tools that can be used there. And then downstream. The people that are going to carry the message for us are going to be the produce guys in Kroger or Safeway or Whole Foods. You know, was this heirloom tomato produced using CRISPR-Cas technology? What does that mean? Is it going to glow in the dark? That message is going to come from the produce section. It's not going to come from us. So how do we help them carry that message between United Fresh Produce, Western Growers, Tomato, all of the groups that can hopefully be our voice down the road about what you're doing in the agriculture community and how exciting it is. So we have to develop some tools that can do that and be proactive and not reactive. We're even thinking to get to a point where we have a list that we list the products that are coming out from our companies and what methods are being used. So that if somebody in the administration wants to look at something or talk to a company, they know where that list is. Of course, that would include, we'd have to include the public varieties that may be developed in universities as well as we go forward. The international arena is a completely different beast, but with the international aspect of agriculture today, in what we have learned, unfortunately, through GMO registrations and keeping them registered in other countries, we don't need to get into that same process. So we've tried to reach out to our colleagues and peers in other countries to start to have a discussion about what is your country thinking, what are your country laws, And how do we influence something so we've got consistency across the globe? Not changing we know they're not going to change their laws, but the implementation part of it is what's key. And can we get them all to go toward a general direction? And it's trying to work with the countries that are active in this arena. You go online and you look at gene editing, or you look at papers for CRISPR-Cas, majority of them are coming from China. But all of these countries have an interest. Japan has a huge interest in this because of their vegetable and flower business and how it's treated. So those are the groups that we're working with and having discussions both with the industry and with the key career officials in those countries. We know there are going to be different definitions, different legal frameworks and approaches. What we want to do is we want to get to a consistent policy. How are countries going to treat these? If it falls within those categories, and I think, if you have that consistent approach and scope, how do you get to policy implementation or acceptance or those kind of things within the science community, within the government, and within the public in the countries as we go forward with gene editing? And again, you have to remember this is going to be in the same communications category as dealing with, hornless cows and human issues and others, and it's all going to fall under, unfortunately, the gene editing rubric as we go forward. And here's the underlying principle that I mentioned earlier, and it's sort of what we put on the table. The country representatives have said, that looks good. Our seed associations in those countries you listed have said, that looks good. So plant varieties developed through the latest breeding methods should not be differentially regulated if they are similar or indistinguishable from varieties that could have been produced through earlier breeding methods. So it's sort of that get around sexually compatible, no express protein, and could get there through what we consider earlier breeding methods. Those are the three essential criteria that I outlined, and the same that we're working with respect to the U.S. To try to hopefully provide somewhat of a bright line as we go forward. That's the same one. So as we go through all of this, we've got to be communicating it. And it's a hard thing to do, as you guys know in Alliance for Science. I mean, as I mentioned to the group earlier, if any of your peers have taken or are taking a genetics class at Cornell through their time here, and they didn't drop it, and they got a C, they're not going to take another class. So any genetics, except you in the room, excuse me, but anybody else on campus is probably going to just say, listen, I got through it, I'm safe, that's all I want. And that may be the extent of what they know on genetics, and they lose it pretty quickly. And so when we start to talk about plant breeding in what we do today, people automatically jump to, well, that's biotech, isn't it? No, it's plant breeding. And people want to stop at, what we used to do, just basic crosses, and we don't know anything more about plants today than we used to. Well, we know a lot more about plants today. And it's because of the work that's been done here on campus and other land-grant institutions that inform us on what makes the plant do what it does, and where there's opportunities and where there's challenges. And so one of the things that we've done, and the reason I got in touch with Sarah, is we're trying to figure out how do we communicate that out. How do you define plant breeding and get through that? So we've changed a lot of what we do, our breeding or our branding, better seed, better life. Try to make it simple. Changed our website, really try to make it a process that talks about plant breeding and what we go through and what it takes. What do plant breeders do? Why is that important? Those kind of things. And it's a basic message, and I know for most in this room it'll be really basic, but it is trying to remind people that plant breeding is the start of the process of the plant. The other processes are tools to ensure that plant grows healthy. These are some of the basics as we look through it, and you can get on our website and see a video that we started the process on. Just about everything that we do on our daily lives, eating, putting on our clothes, driving our vehicle, starts with seed. Seed has a component in just about everything that we do every day. You can't help it. And so we need to realize that, help people understand how it impacts every step as they go through. And then the diversity of seed. For some reason, we've got stuck in the Midwest crops that are biotech, and we forget that produce and the grasses and the cover crops and the flowers the majority of them start with seed somewhere, whether it's a transplant or something. It starts with seed. And so how do you bring that in and remind people that there are a huge world within the seed community? And then the environmental and economic and health and wellness issues, fruits and vegetables, consuming fruits and vegetables. But it goes back to this issue of plant breeder starts with the problem, looking for the solution. How do you find that? What variety is good in wheat to deal with scab? Or you could talk about any crop. You know, as I said earlier, how do you make Brussels sprouts taste more like bacon without introducing the bacon? You know, those kind of things that plant breeders look at on an annual basis. And then the diversity that you bring into the process in the sight, the touch, the feel. So many things that we have in our produce section today that we never had 15 years ago. And we talk about the plant breeding toolbox. And does that toolbox get limited because of whatever policy is eventually adopted because of concerns? What we're doing is getting out more. We've trained our board of directors. We've trained our staff to be able to go out and talk about plant breeding. And now we're working on others, trying to work with the National Association of Plant Breeders, the tri-societies, graduate students, as well as our member companies. How do we help them connect? And we're working on it, you know. We're not always the fastest in developing or accepting technology and utilizing it, but we're getting there. And then you'll see something this year, and I didn't put it up here because of the timing and everything, but we're trying to put a face on plant breeding. And you know, in today's environment, anyone that's taken a marketing class, it's moms, millennials, and foodies. Well, unfortunately, this room is, again, much better than the norm. Unfortunately, most of us that are out there talking about plant breeding and technology and agriculture are old, white-haired guys. You know, and that doesn't carry the message very well, and it's unfortunate. How do we get people that are postdocs, young professors, and moms to carry that message? Our first attempt at this is going to come out hopefully in December. We're just finishing it up. We found a soybean breeder with Pioneer, a mother, 2 beautiful daughters. They grow a big garden in their backyard, and she's a soybean breeder. So we're videoing her from her planting her garden and planting her test plots to mid-season in the summer to harvest. And they were bringing her and her girls to our meeting in Chicago and really putting a human face on it. This is what she does for a living. She has confidence in what she produces and that it's a good product and it's safe and all of those factors. But again, our next one will be fruits and vegetables, or vegetables out in Salinas Valley next year. And then after that, we'll probably do something in the conservation environment arena. But again, try to bring that out. We want to try a video contest. NAPB did it last year. We're trying to work with NAPB to do one with them and tri-societies and get you all to talk about what you do. It doesn't have to just be plant breeding, because we need more than plant breeders out there today. We need plant physiologists, we need agronomists, we need the gamut. So we want to be able to help people talk about what they do to produce new varieties. And that really is where we come from. ASTA does a lot of great things with a very limited staff. I got a fantastic staff. We have a great membership. You know, you think about what our members do every year. They produce enough seed to plant over 400 million acres in the US every single year. I can't put a number on how many golf courses overseeding is done or other places like that, but that's generally our row crops, our cover crops and conservation seed crops that we can get numbers from BLM on, our double crops on vegetables and things like that. Think about it, 400 million acres a year. And that's just here in the US. We do a lot in Canada, we do a lot in Mexico, we do a lot globally. So that opportunity every year to improve what we do is really exciting. And so we appreciate the opportunity to come here today to impart a little insight into who ASTA is and who our membership is and where we think the seed industry is going long term. And I'm a little over, but close. So thanks again for coming out today, and look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Andy. Actually, you have respectfully allowed ample time for question and answers. So we have 15 to 18 minutes for questions, answers, conversation, dialogue. Yeah, come on up.
Hi, thank you. The Rural Women's Assembly, which is an umbrella body that looks at issues of women farmers and their access to quality farm inputs regards women as guardians of seed, life, and the earth. Is there any work that the ASTA is doing in increasing access to quality seed for women farmers, especially in developing countries?
Yeah, there is. We're a collaborator with, a cooperator with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in their international programs. And so we get some resources every year to help those types of programs. And we do our key countries, I don't know if I mentioned them, China, India, Africa, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. And we work in Africa mainly through AGRA, Gates Foundation, and the African Seed Trade Association. They have, there's more NGOs on the ground in Africa than you can, shake a stick at. But they do have the capacity to outreach in certain countries and develop programs. And we know through the Gates Foundation that they're focusing on certain regions that are outreaching to communities to bring in improved seed. And part of the challenges that we have and where we're participating is we're funding industry experts to go into those regions who have experience in developing germplasm. Recently, one of our former board members went over for 2 weeks, and he just is a foundation seed company. So all they do is develop new varieties, and they develop varieties for companies, and then the companies take it. They have their name is not on anything. They've gone over to help set up a cooperative effort in, East Africa, 5 countries in that East Africa region. And he's going back in 2 months to look at progress, to make suggestions and those kind of things, to set up those collaborative efforts. And that's what we were trying to do. We're not trying to sell any company seed. What we're trying to do is set up seed systems so that people understand how do you improve varieties, how do you make varieties available, how do you store them over winter or through hot periods that may damage them, and how do you continue to breed and improve for what the local market needs. So there's a lot going on there, and we think there's going to be some more going on through the universities as well.
There's 6 seats up here if anybody's tired of standing back there. Don't be shy. Yeah.
My interest is in, your earlier slide when you spoke about the review of policies regarding biotech regulation. I don't know, but when you look at the system generally, the socioeconomic system generally, looking at issues about the banking crisis, the financial crisis in the mid-2000s, and how public sentiment has been. A lot more people are calling for increased regulations, they're calling for tighter rules on the economic managers and even on politicians and all of that. With such an economic, with such a social system and the views around that, and it coming at a time when a lot of the people in the biotech industry are calling for more like a stepping down of the regulations when it comes to biotech, because they think it's a lot more complicated and that it has to be simplified. Honestly, don't you think that stepping down the regulations may end up endangering public confidence in the whole regulatory system when it comes to GMOs in particular? Because that's the sense that I get, that the systems you have currently are more ripe for increased regulations, and that's what public sentiments appear to be pointing to.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think when we look at the issue of overregulation or reducing regulation, the current proposal that USDA has is to reduce the regulation of biotech products because of the experience that they have and the knowledge that they've learned over that time frame. Unfortunately, in the current situation we find ourselves in with respect to GMO and public acceptance, whether they reduced it or increased it, there's not going to be any more public acceptance one way or the other. And it's just the place that we find ourselves in. And I don't think it's just in GMOs. To me, it's very sad with respect to the disrespect for science. You look at people who think, what's her name, not the GMO babe, the food babe, versus a scientist from a university. She has more credibility because she got a degree in computer science, and this person has a PhD, and that has been their life's work. Or you look at the same in pharmaceuticals and immunizations. A I hate to get into that whole gamut, but you know, a movie star has more credibility than the science community behind immunizations and what it's done. So there is a shift in the US, I think, and somewhat globally, that scientists don't have the credibility, that they don't have a loud enough bullhorn. I'm not sure what it is, but that's disconcerting. I think science regulation has to evolve, because science it's not static. And if science regulation doesn't evolve, what we find ourselves at, and we're finding it now in a lot of places in the regulatory structure, not just in ag, is that science moves far past it. Right now, even with plant breeding, you know, we are so far past the whole current regulatory structure, Washington doesn't know what to do with themselves. And that's just on plants. Imagine when you get to animals and then humans. And so that's why it's all thrown into the same bucket. We went into offices as high up as Office of Science and Technology Policy, who thought USDA, BRS was regulating all new plant varieties coming into the marketplace. All new plant varieties. Can you imagine how many tomato varieties come into the market every year? Grass variety? No, we don't regulate, we don't pre-market regulate new varieties coming to the marketplace. Even our government doesn't understand where they are. So I don't think that's going to change the dynamics of it. You know, there are a group that are against GMOs or against them because, one, it's all owned by Monsanto in their mantra, and two, it hasn't been researched enough. We haven't had enough life cycles to prove that it's safe, so therefore it needs more regulation. Well, that's not how the US regulates. We try to stay with science, and I'm concerned that we're getting away from some of that. But I think that's not going to make a difference whether we do more regulation than GMO or less. Those who don't trust the science are not going to trust it any more or less.
My name is Oscar Bjørnstad from Norway.
Yes.
So I'm just referring a little bit to the European context here. And there was one.
Wait, the context is different than the US?
Oh, yes.
I know, I'm just kidding. I know. Just my sarcasm,
And there's
sorry.
also another one. There's a type of regulation that you didn't mention.
Cautionary
And
principle?
that is the IP regulation, intellectual property.
Yep.
And which is highly controversial in Europe. Because we have something called the European Patent Organization that last year ruled that you can patent novel traits, which is actually in that case, it was a backcross trait from wild tomato or wild cabbage, which has sort of upset the seed industry very much in Europe. So that, for instance, the Dutch seed industry is very worried. I mean, a lot of small seed companies, they are very worried about access not only to technologies, but this whole concept that traits can be patented. And another thing is that both Holland and Germany, France and Switzerland, and it's suggested also in Norway, that anything that is patented as a technology, it's free for use by breeders until the day you got to market a variety. So you don't need any agreement or any permit in Germany or in France. If you want to use a patented trait, it's straightforward, and you can evaluate which method is best and so on, and which is very different from the US situation. And my point of view here is that without really for the business, and the European business, I think, sees this, that without taking this control issue and the access issue just as serious as the regulatory issue, you know, one won't get anywhere in the discussion. So my direct question is, do you have a lot of these same different points of view also in the ASTA, like in the European, for instance, very much so in the European Seed Association? Yeah. And just to give even Syngenta, not even Syngenta, they are very positive and about saying that we allow all our technologies free for use by any breeder until the day you go to market a variety. And then they can give you a fixed license at a fair price, you know, which, as far as I understand, is very different from how you operate in the United States. So is this a controversial thing also in your organization?
You know, we work very closely with ASA and Plantum in Holland and other European associations. And our position has always been each country has their own means by which they protect intellectual property. And the US has a system in place that provides patent for process patents as well as variety patents. And yes, it does protect the varieties as they come through the marketplace. We really don't have much disagreement in the US. You know, yeah, people would like to have access to somebody's newest, brightest, best variety that's been patented, but they either have to go to that company and ask for permission to get it, or they have to wait till it goes off patent. But it's just a system that we have in the US. I think the system likely will continue to change or evolve as we look at new methods to bring varieties into the marketplace quicker, potentially with gene editing techniques. But you know, globally, we've had this discussion, and I think it's really calmed down some between the US and Europe with respect to how you deal with, both our systems are dramatically different. You know, when a product goes off PVP in Europe, they can get their parent lines back. In the US, they go into the public domain. You know, so I think there's a lot of differences that go into it. What we've tried to do is say, okay, we need to figure out how do we best have varieties available for the marketplace as well as for additional breeding. And then how do you have conversations? A lot of this came out of our varieties from the Midwest and row crops, but it has moved into the vegetable industry. But also my vegetable companies that are also Dutch and German vegetable companies, HM Close and Vijo and others, you develop a variety that's resistant to downy mildew, you're not going to patent it because you only got 3 years of life in that variety anyway. So why waste the money and time? You know, so things are changing. But also, we have companies that put 6 or 7 years into developing a variety. They patent it the second year, third year, because they see promise, so that they have some protection while they finish developing. They end up having 14 years of protection. It's not 20 years from when they go to market. So there are differences. I think the differences are evolving. I think plant breeding is evolving. And I think the companies that are, what I would say, legitimate in the marketplace want to ensure that they have a means to get reimbursed for that, but also want to make sure that they don't have, what lack of a better way to say it, the night breeding going on out there that we've seen in some industries around the world. And so it's a delicate balance. And I think we decided between, under the umbrella of the International Seed Federation, we decided that it wasn't worth having a battle between the Europeans and the US on intellectual property all the time and not looking at the rest of the world where their growth is. And so how do we say, okay, here's where our policy is as an international federation, and then how do we help other countries develop their seed systems? They're going to develop their intellectual property how they will. And that's what we've done. And the main focus with that, I think, has been UPOV and plant variety protection. So.
2 questions here. We'll go with the orange and next to you. Yeah.
How important do your members sign public sector plant breeding? And if so, do you guys do a lot of advocacy for funding at the federal level, like through USDA or support of state land grants?
Well, we came out not long ago, but reinforced about 8 years ago where we are. And the land grant system is absolutely vital to our industry. Whether you're producing our future students or our collaborators or developing programs within the land grant institution. You know, and this was really right around 2006-07 because of the economic crisis at that time and the impact it was having on our land grant systems. So it's absolutely vital to us. And we are very strong advocates of funding through USDA, through NIFA, through ARS for that. I think the question that we have and others in the agriculture community, whether it's grower groups or others as we go forward, is what does that system look like going forward? Because a lot of times when we look at it, well, we want to get it back to where we were in the 80s. We got direct line item appropriations, we got money here, we got money there, the state was giving us a bunch of money. Well, it's changed. And so we're on a different footing. We can't have, and I hope I'm not picking on any wheat breeders in the room, and I always use this one because my director of Vice President of Government Affairs used to work for the wheat growers. We can't have a wheat breeding program at every land grant university. We can't. It's not feasible, and we don't have the staff to do that. So how do you have collaborative programs across the country, whether you call them centers of excellence or what? We don't have the capacity to rebuild programs that have gone away, or, you know, for political reasons, you know, institutions have shuffled. A plant breeder leaves, retires, they go hire an entomologist, or vice versa. You know, those are situations that we've got to deal with too. But we are strong advocates for the land grant system. We know that there are a lot of things that seed companies can't do. The land grants do a lot of research on crops that are not major crops, especially in the small grains, vegetable side of the world, that are vital to what we do. And we collaborate with them, we license those products, bring them to the market. So we've got to have that strong land grant system first and foremost, above anything else. And again, they train the future generation of employees and collaborators. You know, we don't care whether you go public or private. We want you to graduate and come out into the world and find solutions and work with us, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in here in the U.S. So very strong supporters.
Question, we'll go here and then Ed.
I'm wondering, technologies aside, what feedback are you obtaining from company members regarding the incentive that the market currently gives for working on quality traits? Like, is it incentivized currently in our marketplace to work on nutrition, to work on anything aside from yield and disease?
Well, it depends on what area you're talking about. In vegetables, there is. I think there really is a strong desire there for flavor, for shelf stability, those kind of things that, you know, the vegetable seed industry is growing pretty well. High single digits, low double digits a year, because people are already finally starting to listen to the government and say, you know, you need to have that plate full of greens, or you eat your fruits and vegetables. And so it's finally, it's taken us, what, 4 generations? Anyway, so there is some growth there, and there's opportunity in that area. And a lot of that is to the consumer. The consumer doesn't care whether it's disease resistant or something like that. It wants flavor. How long is it going to last in my refrigerator? Does it taste good? You know, is it neat, new variety? When you look at row crops, it's still predominantly yield. Some specialty areas are becoming more prominent, specialty oils. Some of the feed companies are starting to look at better feed quality for grain, and those are coming along, but I think they're still a distant second or third to yield. And that's what feed companies or grain companies are still going to pay on bushel per acre, and if you get paid on bushel, you want to grow bushel. Unless you get a specialty or identity preserved demand from a company, then you're going to produce for that, and that'll be a long-term relationship.
So,
Ed, the last question?
So one of the things I've kind of seen in order to get consumer acceptance, and I think you're exactly right, that most people, there may be 400 million acres out there that are transgenic and everything, but only 1% of the population sees that, or 2%, right? They don't see any of those benefits. I'm wondering how much you all are working with, say, the environmental community, maybe, obviously you're not going to do their work, but politically working with them to maybe solve some of our environmental problems using the same technology. So then you contact a much larger set of the community, and you're not going to get Greenpeace on board, but say Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Foundation.
We do work really close with them, and you hit it, World Wildlife Foundation, Nature Conservancy. I mean, we try to work with Greenpeace and give them the information, and the companies are working there to provide that. Not a lot of acceptance. So, when how do you pronounce it? Leonis, when he stepped down and supported GMOs, one of the founders of Greenpeace, I think that created such a chasm. No matter what we do, we're never going to fill that. That battle continues. But there are groups that realize that, the way that we produce today is, whether you call it monocropping or whether it's evolving agriculture production, that's the way it's going to be. And I think we're starting to see price changes. You're starting to see people, okay, how do I rotate? I need to get back to something other than a corn on corn on corn, soybean corn on corn on corn in the Midwest and the issues. We've got other things happening with Des Moines Waterworks and Lake Erie and Chesapeake Bay. How do you deal with conservation, tillage, and get back to some of those concepts that farmers are starting to adopt without getting paid for? In the 70s and 80s, that had to be a farm bill program. So we're trying to work with them to find solutions instead of just battle. And I don't think we're ever going to get rid of that. Some groups just want to battle because that's how they raise their money. We feel that from ASTA's standpoint, we can span all of those boundaries. We have a challenging effort right now in trying to figure out organic seed issues. People want availability of organic seed, and our guys produce organic seed. You know what the number one problem I think we've identified? Organic producers want to buy organic seed from organic seed companies. Well, we don't have many organic seed companies. We have seed companies that happen to produce seed that are organic, conventional, and some biotech. So if they're just looking for an organic seed company, even Johnny's Select out of Maine doesn't just produce organic seed. They've got conventional seed available as well. So we have to figure out how to make an introduction to say, here's our seed companies. You've got to talk about demand. So we're trying to find those solutions. And I think with the environmental groups, one of the areas that we see as a huge benefit is this issue of plant breeding techniques. If we can go into the vegetable community and find the naturally occurring resistance in these broad, wide families of crops in that arena, we can bring in a lot of resistance that's going to potentially reduce agrochemical use. And if we can do that in that community, that's a huge benefit, not only for the farmer and his employees in the environment, but across the board. You know, and where can we bring them into this picture to say, this can be a benefit for us, because there is a lot of opportunity in the vegetable arena that right now is not untapped, I shouldn't say that, but it is being discovered. So.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for an engaging conversation.
Thank you very much.